Jane, Jane Austen, 1775 to 1817. Jane Austen was born in Steventon, England, in 1775, where she lived for the first 25 years of her life. Her father, George Austen, was the rector of the local parish and taught her largely at home. She began to write while in her teens and completed the original manuscript of Pride and Prejudice, titled First Impressions, between 1796 and 1797. A publisher rejected the manuscript, and it was not until 1809 that Austen began the revisions that would bring it to its final form. Pride and Prejudice was published in January 1813, 2 years after Sense and Sensibility, her first novel, and it achieved a popularity that has endured to this day. Austen published 4 more novels: Mansfield Park, Emma, Northanger Abbey, and Persuasion. The last 2 were published in 1818, a year after her death. During Austen's life, however, only her immediate family knew of her authorship of these novels. At one point, she wrote behind a door that creaked when visitors approached. This warning allowed her to hide manuscripts before anyone could enter. Though publishing anonymously prevented her from acquiring an authorial reputation, it also enabled her to preserve her privacy at a time when English society associated a female's entrance into the public sphere with a reprehensible loss of femininity. Additionally, Austen may have sought anonymity because of the more general atmosphere of repression pervading her era. As the Napoleonic Wars, 1800–1815, threatened the safety of monarchies throughout Europe, government censorship of literature proliferated. The social milieu of Austen's Regency England was particularly stratified, and class divisions were rooted in family connections and wealth. In her work, Austen is often critical of the assumptions and prejudices of upper-class England. She distinguishes between internal merit, goodness of person, and external merit, rank and possessions. Though she frequently satirizes snobs, she also pokes fun at the poor breeding and misbehavior of those lower on the social scale. Nevertheless, Austen was in many ways a realist, and the England she depicts is one in which social mobility is limited and class consciousness is strong. Socially regimented ideas of appropriate behavior for each gender factored into Austen's work as well. While social advancement for young men lay in the military, church, or law, the chief method of self-improvement for women was the acquisition of wealth. Women could only accomplish this goal through successful marriage, which explains the ubiquity of matrimony as a goal and topic of conversation in Austen's writing. Though young women of Austen's day had more freedom to choose their husbands than in the early 18th century, practical considerations continued to limit their options. Even so, critics often accuse Austen of portraying a limited world. As a clergyman's daughter, Austen would have done parish work and was certainly aware of the poor around her. However, she wrote about her own world, not theirs. The critiques she her English Literature Part I study material novel 2 makes of class structure seem to include only the middle class and upper class. The lower classes, if they appear at all, are generally servants who seem perfectly pleased with their lot. This lack of interest in the lives of the poor may be a failure on Austen's part, but it should be understood as a failure shared by almost all of English society at the time. In general, Austen occupies a curious position between the 18th and 19th centuries. Her favorite writer, whom she often quotes in her novels, was Dr. Samuel Johnson, the great model of 18th century classicism and reason. Her plots, which often feature characters forging their respective ways through an established and rigid social hierarchy, bear similarities to such works of Johnson's contemporaries as Pamela, written by Samuel Richardson. Austen's novels also display an ambiguity about emotion and an appreciation for intelligence and natural beauty that aligns them with Romanticism. In their awareness of the conditions of modernity and city life and the consequences for family structure and individual characters, they prefigure much Victorian literature, as does her usage of such elements as frequent formal social gatherings, sketchy characters, and scandal. Jane Austen's life resembles her novels. At first glance they seem to be composed of a series of quiet, unexceptional events. Such an impression is supported by the comment of her brother, Henry, who wrote after her death that her life was not by any means a life of event. Similarly, her nephew James added in a biography published 50 years later that of events her life was singularly barren. Few changes and no great crisis ever broke the smooth current of its course. However, just as readers find that the complexity of Austen's novel lies in its characters and style, those studying Austen herself discover that the events of her life are secondary to her compelling personality, quick wit, and highly developed powers of observation. The fact that Austen's life lacked the drama that other authors may have experienced in no way detracted from her skill as a writer. In actuality, Austen's lack of extraordinary experiences, as well as of a spouse and children, probably made her writing possible by freeing her time to work on her books. Additionally, because her books were published anonymously, Austen never achieved personal recognition for her works outside of her sphere of family and friends. Such anonymity suited her, for, as literary critic Richard Blythe notes, literature, not the literary life, was always her intention. Historical context for Pride and Prejudice. Late 18th century Britain and the Regency period. Jane Austen's brief life and writing career overlapped with one of the most transformative eras in British history, marked by revolution abroad and unrest at home. The signing of the Declaration of Independence in 1776, the year after Austen's birth, signaled the start of the American Revolution, followed in the next decade by the beginning of the French Revolution in 1789. For the next 2 decades, Britain was engaged almost without cease in the Revolutionary and Napoleonic Wars of 1793–1815, one of the most significant conflicts in British history. Among the effects of England's foreign wars during this period were great financial instability and monetary volatility. The precariousness of the late 18th century was followed in the 1810s and 1820s by what is known as the Regency period. The Regency officially began in 1811, when King George III went permanently insane and his son George, Prince of Wales, was sanctioned to rule England in his place as M. English Literature Part I Study Material Novel 3 Regent. The political regency lasted until 1820, when George IV was crowned. However, the Regency period has also come to refer more generally to the early decades of the 19th century before the start of Victoria's reign in 1837, during which the Prince Regent provided a great deal of support for the development of the arts and sciences that flourished during this period. Austen would have witnessed, moreover, the beginning of industrialization in England, though the growth of the factory system would not reach its peak until the middle of the 19th century. Outside of the genteel world we see in Pride and Prejudice, a third of the country's population lived on the verge of starvation, spurring food riots across the countryside. This unrest was compounded by Luddite protesters who attacked new industrial machinery, a practice called machine breaking, in demonstrations that were a precursor to labor strikes. As these demonstrations spread fear of a revolution in England, the government responded with repressive measures that sharply curtailed freedom of speech. War with France, stretching over 22 years. Britain's war with France affected every level of British society. While an estimated 250,000 men were serving in the regular army, a militia of officers and volunteers in the southeast coast of England, the region where Austen was from, mobilized for what was thought to be an impending invasion by Napoleon. Austen had a close connection to the militia, as her brother Henry joined the Oxfordshire militia in 1793. Though the rural countryside in which Austen's novels are set seems at a far remove from the tumultuousness of the period, the world of Pride and Prejudice bears the traces of turmoil abroad. As Gillian Russell writes, the hum of wartime, if not the blast or cry of battle, pervades Austen's fiction. 1. The presence of the troops at Brighton and militia officers like Wickham reflect wider concerns about the place of the military in English civil society. The landed gentry. The novel is also embedded within a set of domestic concerns over property, money and status that highlight the changing social landscape of late 18th and early 19th century England. Austen's novels portray the gentry, a broad social class that includes those who owned land, the country or landed gentry, as well as the professional classes, lawyers, doctors and clergy, who did not. Though industrialization and urbanization had begun to take hold at the end of the 18th century, the most influential sector of society in Austen's time was the landed gentry. Throughout the 18th and 19th centuries, ownership of English land was concentrated in the hands of the relatively small landed classes, who retained their hold over the land through a system that encouraged the consolidation and extension of estates by enforcing strict inheritance laws. Entails of the kind referred to in the novel were established during this period in order to concentrate wealth and enlarge estates by funneling property to male children or male relatives rather than breaking it up and distributing it amongst family members. Thus, Mr. Bennet's land is left not to his daughters but to a male member of his extended family, Mr. Collins, ensuring that the property stays in the family line, while disinheriting Elizabeth and her sisters. Large country estates, of the kind Darcy and Mr. Bingley own, served as a symbol of the wealth and power of the landed gentry. Marriage and gender roles, as we see in the novel, questions of land ownership and inheritance are closely interlinked with courtship and marriage. In the late 18th century, English conceptions of family and the role of women began to change, as British culture became increasingly focused on the accumulation and concentration of wealth within the family. One way for families to rapidly accumulate English literature Part I study material novel for capital was through advantageous marriages. As a result, the position of daughters within the family changed, as they became the means through which a family could attain greater wealth. Familial aspirations, coupled with women's increased dependence on marriage for financial survival, made courtship a central focus of women's lives. At the same time, the late 18th century also witnessed a transformation in the conception of women's rights following the publication of Mary Wollstonecraft's Vindication of the Rights of Women in 1792. In the Vindication, Wollstonecraft argues, in the language of Enlightenment thinkers like John Locke, that women should be treated as the rational equals of men. Elizabeth Bennet serves as a paradigmatic example of the conflicting transformations in women's roles that occurred in the late 18th century. Disinherited of her father's property, Elizabeth is not financially independent, and in fact depends upon an advantageous marriage for her future survival. Yet throughout the novel, she asserts an intellectual and moral independence that reflects a Wollstonecraftian conception of gender politics. Print culture and the novel in Austen's time. One particularly significant change that occurred during Austen's lifetime was the expansion of literacy and print culture in England. By 1800, almost everyone in the middle classes and above could read, and literacy rates for the rest of the population rose steadily thereafter. At the same time, from 1780 onwards there was a fairly steady rise in the number of new novels being published, so that by the end of Austen's life, the novel was the dominant form of literature in England. In part, the rise of the novel was spurred on by new forms of printing and marketing, which made books less expensive and expanded their readership. Smaller format books, octavos and duodecimos, as opposed to quartos, were more portable, and therefore easier to consume. Similarly, novels became more readily accessible through the expansion of various modes of access, including circulating and subscription libraries as well as periodicals, which made literature affordable in a time when books were often prohibitively expensive. Nevertheless, novels of the kind Austen published would have been an unaffordable luxury for a great deal of the population. This was particularly true in the earlier part of the 19th century, when taxes on knowledge raised prices on paper, newspapers, advertisements, and other texts. These taxes were in fact at their height during Austen's career. This was in part because of a desire to limit access to information for the lower classes in response to revolution in France and upheaval at home. Though the late 18th and early 19th centuries marked an explosion in novel reading and the production of the novels themselves, the widely affordable novel would not become ubiquitous until the middle of the 19th century. The realist novel, defined by its putatively objective narrator, psychologically developed characters, and minute description of the realities of domestic life, was in part inaugurated by Austen in Pride and Prejudice, and would come to dominate the literary scene in England throughout the rest of the 19th century. The rise of the novel has historically been linked to the rise of the middle class in England from the 18th century onwards, because this expanding social class, and middle-class women in particular, had both the income and the leisure time available to consume them. Her novels were widely read throughout the late 18th and early 19th centuries, but they were largely considered unserious, frivolous, and even irrelevant, a merely popular genre. English Literature Part I Study Material Novel 5 Pride and Prejudice. Plot overview. The news that a wealthy young gentleman named Charles Bingley has rented the manor of Netherfield Park causes a great stir in the nearby village of Longbourn, especially in the Bennet household. The Bennets have 5 unmarried daughters, from oldest to youngest, Jane, Elizabeth, Mary, Kitty, and Lydia, and Mrs. Bennet is desperate to see them all married. After Mr. Bennet pays a social visit to Mr. Bingley, the Bennets attend a ball at which Mr. Bingley is present. He is taken with Jane and spends much of the evening dancing with her. His close friend, Mr. Darcy, is less pleased with the evening and haughtily refuses to dance with Elizabeth, which makes everyone view him as arrogant and obnoxious. At social functions over subsequent weeks, however, Mr. Darcy finds himself increasingly attracted to Elizabeth's charm and intelligence. Jane's friendship with Mr. Bingley also continues to burgeon, and Jane pays a visit to the Bingley mansion. On her journey to the house she is caught in a downpour and catches ill, forcing her to stay at Netherfield for several days. In order to tend to Jane, Elizabeth hikes through muddy fields and arrives with a splattered dress, much to the disdain of the snobbish Miss Bingley, Charles Bingley's sister. Miss Bingley's spite only increases when she notices that Darcy, whom she is pursuing, pays quite a bit of attention to Elizabeth. When Elizabeth and Jane return home, they find Mr. Collins visiting their household. Mr. Collins is a young clergyman who stands to inherit Mr. Bennet's property, which has been entailed, meaning that it can only be passed down to male heirs. Mr. Collins is a pompous fool, though he is quite enthralled by the Bennet girls. Shortly after his arrival, he makes a proposal of marriage to Elizabeth. She turns him down, wounding his pride. Meanwhile, the Bennet girls have become friendly with militia officers stationed in a nearby town. Among them is Wickham, a handsome young soldier who is friendly toward Elizabeth and tells her how Darcy cruelly cheated him out of an inheritance. At the beginning of winter, the Bingleys and Darcy leave Netherfield and return to London, much to Jane's dismay. A further shock arrives with the news that Mr. Collins has become engaged to Charlotte Lucas, Elizabeth's best friend and the poor daughter of a local knight. Charlotte explains to Elizabeth that she is getting older and needs the match for financial reasons. Charlotte and Mr. Collins get married and Elizabeth promises to visit them at their new home. As winter progresses, Jane visits the city to see friends, hoping also that she might see Mr. Bingley. However, Miss Bingley visits her and behaves rudely, while Mr. Bingley fails to visit her at all. The marriage prospects for the Bennet girls appear bleak. That spring, Elizabeth visits Charlotte, who now lives near the home of Mr. Collins's patron, Lady Catherine de Bourgh, who is also Darcy's aunt. Darcy calls on Lady Catherine and encounters Elizabeth, whose presence leads him to make a number of visits to the Collinses' home, where she is staying. One day, he makes a shocking proposal of marriage, which Elizabeth quickly refuses. She tells Darcy that she considers him arrogant and unpleasant, then scolds him for steering Bingley away from Jane and disinheriting Wickham. Darcy leaves her but shortly thereafter delivers a letter to her. In this letter, he admits that he urged Bingley to distance himself from Jane, but claims he did so only because he thought their romance was not serious. As for Wickham, he English Literature Part I Study Material Novel 6 informs Elizabeth that the young officer is a liar and that the real cause of their disagreement was Wickham's attempt to elope with his young sister, Georgiana Darcy. This letter causes Elizabeth to re-evaluate her feelings about Darcy. She returns home and acts coldly toward Wickham. The militia is leaving town, which makes the younger, rather man-crazy Bennet girls distraught. Lydia manages to obtain permission from her father to spend the summer with an old colonel in Brighton, where Wickham's regiment will be stationed. With the arrival of June, Elizabeth goes on another journey, this time with the Gardiners, who are relatives of the Bennets. The trip takes her to the north and eventually to the neighborhood of Pemberley, Darcy's estate. She visits Pemberley, after making sure that Darcy is away, and delights in the building and grounds, while hearing from Darcy's servants that he is a wonderful, generous master. Suddenly, Darcy arrives and behaves cordially toward her. Making no mention of his proposal, he entertains the Gardiners and invites Elizabeth to meet his sister. Shortly thereafter, however, a letter arrives from home, telling Elizabeth that Lydia has eloped with Wickham and that the couple is nowhere to be found, which suggests that they may be living together out of wedlock. Fearful of the disgrace such a situation would bring on her entire family, Elizabeth hastens home. Mr. Gardiner and Mr. Bennet go off to search for Lydia, but Mr. Bennet eventually returns home empty-handed. Just when all hope seems lost, a letter comes from Mr. Gardiner saying that the couple has been found and that Wickham has agreed to marry Lydia in exchange for an annual income. The Bennets are convinced that Mr. Gardiner has paid off Wickham, but Elizabeth learns that the source of the money, and of her family's salvation, was none other than Darcy. Now married, Wickham and Lydia return to Longbourn briefly, where Mr. Bennet treats them coldly. They then depart for Wickham's new assignment in the north of England. Shortly thereafter, Bingley returns to Netherfield and resumes his courtship of Jane. Darcy goes to stay with him and pays visits to the Bennets but makes no mention of his desire to marry Elizabeth. Bingley, on the other hand, presses his suit and proposes to Jane, to the delight of everyone but Bingley's haughty sister. While the family celebrates, Lady Catherine de Bourgh pays a visit to Longbourn. She corners Elizabeth and says that she has heard that Darcy, her nephew, is planning to marry her. Since she considers a Bennet an unsuitable match for Darcy, Lady Catherine demands that Elizabeth promise to refuse him. Elizabeth spiritedly refuses, saying she is not engaged to Darcy, but she will not promise anything against her own happiness. A little later, Elizabeth and Darcy go out walking together and he tells her that his feelings have not altered since the spring. She tenderly accepts his proposal, and both Jane and Elizabeth are married. Critical analysis of Pride and Prejudice. Pride and Prejudice, published in 1830, had originally been titled First Impressions. The original title seems apt enough as the whole novel deals with the unreliability of first impressions. The new title, however, focuses attention on the main theme of the novel, which traces how pride and prejudice as two human traits guide relationships, and this is brought out with respect to the relationship between two central figures of the novel, Mr. Darcy and Elizabeth Bennet. It is believed that these two characters are studies in Pride and Prejudice respectively. On a superficial level this view holds true, but it would English Literature Part I Study Material Novel 7 certainly be oversimplifying matters to say that this alone brings out the full significance of the title. Pride certainly is the predominant characteristic of Mr. Darcy. On his very first appearance he makes himself highly unpopular, for he is discovered to be excruciatingly arrogant and above being pleased. His pride that stems out of his superiority of intellect, his noble ancestry and enormous wealth prejudices him strongly against Elizabeth's family and her low connections. Darcy's is actually a social prejudice, a variant of the conventional snobbery of the aristocratic class. Although he had never been bewitched by any woman as he was by her, Darcy feels it beneath his dignity to admit to his love for her. Even when he can repress his feelings no longer and does propose to Elizabeth, he was not more eloquent on the subject of tenderness than on pride. In fact, his customary arrogance deepens into what amounts to insolence during the proposal, in which he explains to her the various family obstacles he has had to overcome and the degradation this marriage will be for him. He is considerably humbled when he is rejected without ceremony, and Elizabeth's words, "Had you behaved in a more gentlemanlike manner," and her criticism of his conceit and selfish disdain of the feelings of others affect him deeply. Elizabeth's refusal initiates a process of introspection and self-criticism, and he emerges as a man whose pride has been humbled. This is revealed in the way he welcomes the Gardiners at his estate, and also by his long explanatory speech to Elizabeth towards the end of the novel. The greatest proof of this development is in his remaining firm in his choice of Elizabeth even after Lydia's and Wickham's dishonorable elopement, which draws from Elizabeth the acknowledgement indeed he has no improper pride. He is perfectly amiable. In Elizabeth, the intelligent and self-assured young woman too, we see the same interesting compound of pride and prejudice. Her initial prejudice against Darcy arises from injured pride. At the assembly she overhears Darcy's remark about herself: "She is tolerable but not handsome enough to tempt me." From that evening Eliza is left with no cordial feelings towards Darcy. On the other hand, Elizabeth is prejudiced in favor of Wickham, charmed by his fine countenance, pleasing addresses and his flattering attentions, and when he provides slanderous information against Darcy, the possibility of doubting Wickham does not occur to Elizabeth, and her prejudice against Darcy takes the shape of moral indignation. It is only when she reads Darcy's letter that her eyes are opened to the true character of both. In fact, Darcy's letter induces in Elizabeth the same self-criticism that Darcy too undergoes. She begins reading it with a strong prejudice against everything that he might have to say, but on reflection she realizes how blind, partial, prejudiced and absurd she had been. She was flattered and pleased by his attentions to her and her uncle and aunt at Pemberley, and when she learns Darcy's role in buying Lydia a marriage to Wickham, she grieves over every ungracious sensation that she has ever encouraged towards him. For herself she was humbled, but she was proud of him. The traits of Pride and Prejudice do not dominate merely the main figures, and the significance of this title is worked out perfectly through the minor characters as well. Pride in some of the minor characters takes the form of pompous and comic self-importance in Mr. Collins. Social prejudice finds embodiment in Bingley's sisters, Lady Catherine and her daughter, and renders them quite contemptible. Thus we see that the appropriateness of the title of Pride and Prejudice is indeed unquestionable, and it bears English Literature Part I Study Material Novel 8 immense significance to the plot, thematic concerns and the characterization in the novel. Love and marriage. In Pride and Prejudice it is a truth universally acknowledged that a single man in possession of a good fortune must be in want of a wife. Jane Austen stated the main subject of the novel is stated in the first sentence. In this statement, Jane has cleverly done three things. She has declared that the main subject of the novel will be courtship and marriage. She has established the humorous tone of the novel by taking a simple subject to elaborate and to speak intelligently of, and she has prepared the reader for a chase in the novel of either a husband in reach of a wife, or a woman in pursuit of a husband. All the 5 marriages in the novel contrast each other to reveal Jane's opinions and thoughts on the subject of marriage. The marriage between Darcy and Elizabeth reveals the characteristics which constitutes a successful marriage. One of these characteristics is that the feeling cannot be brought on by appearances, and must gradually develop between the two people as they get to know one another. In the beginning Elizabeth and Darcy were distant from each other because of their prejudice. The series of events, which they both experienced, gave them the opportunity to understand one another and the time to reconcile their feelings for each other. Thus, their mutual understanding is the foundation of their relationship and will lead them to a peaceful and lasting marriage. This relationship between Elizabeth and Darcy reveals the importance of getting to know one's partner before marrying. At the end, Elizabeth feels the pure sincerity of Darcy. She began now to comprehend that he was exactly the man who in disposition and talents would most suit to her. So, Elizabeth and Darcy's marriage is marriage of dissimilarity and long understanding, and we know that long understanding always helps in judging positive and negative points of each other. In this way their marriage is a successful marriage. The marriage between Jane and Bingley is also an example of successful marriage. Jane Austen, through Elizabeth, expresses her opinion of this in the novel. Really believed all his, Bingley, expectations of felicity to be rationally founded, because they had for basis the excellent understanding and super-excellent disposition of Jane, and a general similarity of feeling and taste between her and himself. However, unlike Darcy and Elizabeth, there is a plan in their relationships. The flaw in that both characters are too gullible and too good-hearted to ever act strongly against external forces that may attempt to separate them. Mr. Bennet says you, Jane and Bingley, are each of you so complying, that nothing will ever be resolved on, so easy, that every servant will cheat you, and so generous, that you will always exceed your income. So, their marriage is in between success and failure. English Literature Part I Study Material Novel 9. Obviously, Lydia and Wickham's marriage is an example of bad marriage. Their marriage was based on appearances, good looks, and sensual or sexual pleasures and youthful vivacity. Once each other can no longer see these qualities, the once strong relationship will solemnly fade away. As in the novel, Lydia and Wickham's marriage gradually disintegrates. Lydia becomes a regular visitor at her two elder sisters' home, and her husband was gone to enjoy himself in London or Bath. Through their relationship, Jane Austen shows that hasty marriage based on superficial qualities quickly looks and leads to unhappiness. Marriage of Mr. Bennet and Mrs. Bennet was similar to that of Lydia and Wickham. Mr. Bennet had married a woman he found sexually attractive without realizing she was an unintelligent woman. Mrs. Bennet's favoritism towards Lydia and her comments on how she was once as energetic as Lydia reveals this similarity. Mr. Bennet's comment on Wickham being his favorite son-in-law reinforces this parallelism. The effect of the relationships was that Mr. Bennet would isolate himself from his family. He found refuge in his library or in mocking his wife. Mr. Bennet's self-realization at the end of the novel, in which he discovers that his lack of attention towards his family had led his family to develop the way they are, was too late to save his family. He is Jane Austen's example of a weak father. Austen says about Mrs. Bennet, she was a woman of mean understanding, little information and uncertain temperament. The business of her life was to get her daughters married. Therefore, her solace was visiting and views. About their marriage, her father, captivating by youth and beauty and that appearance of good humor, with youth and beauty generally gave, had married a woman whose weak understanding and illiberal mind had very early in their marriage put an end to all real affection for her. Respect, esteem and confidence had vanished forever, and all his veins of domestic happiness were overthrown. In these two later relationships, Austen shows that it is necessary to use good judgment to select a spouse, otherwise the two people will lose respect for each other. The last example of a marriage is of a different nature than the ones mentioned above. The marriage between Mr. Collins and Charlotte is based on economics rather than on love or appearance. It was a common practice during Austen's time for women to marry a husband to save her from spinsterhood or to gain financial security. However, Jane Austen dramatizes this form of women inequality and shows that women who submits them to this type of marriage will have to suffer in tormenting silence, as Charlotte does. When Mr. Collins said anything of which his wife might reasonably be ashamed, which certainly was not unseldom, she, Elizabeth, would involuntarily turn her eye on Charlotte. Once or twice she could discern a faint blush, but in general Charlotte wisely did not hear. In Pride and Prejudice, Jane has denounced the elements of marriage and society that she found distasteful. These 5 marriages contribute that a happy and strong marriage takes time to build and must be based on mutual feeling, understanding, and respect. Hasty marriages acting on impulse and based on English Literature Part I Study Material Novel 10 superficial qualities will not survive and will lead to inevitable unhappiness. In this novel, love and marriage go together like a horse and carriage. Pride and Prejudice, Title: The title Pride and Prejudice better suits the book because the two protagonists of the novel are affected by these qualities. Elizabeth Bennet, the main female protagonist, judges her acquaintances based upon selective information, and she is proud when these judgments are correct. Fitzwilliam Darcy, the main male protagonist, is disliked because of his proud behavior. As the novel progresses, the love between these two characters becomes what cures them of these bad habits. Pride and Prejudice is the most suitable title for this novel because it directly relates to the relationship between the two most important characters, whereas First Impressions only connects to Elizabeth's prejudiced attitude towards others. Pride is the major fault of Mr. Darcy's character, and it is this pride that initiates Elizabeth's prejudice towards him. At the ball in the opening scene of the novel, Darcy establishes his character with this rude comment: "She is tolerable, but not handsome enough to tempt me." Austen 13. This is Mr. Darcy's first interaction with Elizabeth, and it establishes his pride. He dances very little at the ball, and this offends most of the people attending it. This instance is what makes Elizabeth then think of Darcy as the proudest, most disagreeable man in the world. Elizabeth's prejudice develops further as the novel progresses. She selectively chooses to believe only the information that supports her initial judgments. When Elizabeth first meets Mr. Wickham, she is attracted to his handsome features and agreeable attitude. She becomes inclined to believe his story about Mr. Darcy. Elizabeth searches for negative information on Mr. Darcy, and she is pleased whenever she acquires any. When Mr. Wickham tells his false tale that ruins Mr. Darcy's name, she believes all that he says because Elizabeth is prejudiced against Mr. Darcy. She is entertained and fascinated by this rumor because Elizabeth takes pride in the accuracy of her initial prejudice. Elizabeth does not recognize the pride she has within herself because she is too occupied noticing it in Mr. Darcy as a result of her prejudice towards him. Both Elizabeth and Mr. Darcy's feelings change after his proposal to her. Darcy states that it was hard for his love to overcome the many obstacles it had to face, such as his love would result in a very imprudent marriage on his part. Elizabeth, though offended that he insulted her family, could not be insensible to the compliment of such a man's affection. This shows that Elizabeth yet again has pride in the fact that she has inspired love in Mr. Darcy, despite her hatred for him. Elizabeth states that she would still deny him even if Mr. Darcy had behaved in a more gentlemanlike manner. This phrase stays with Mr. Darcy and causes him to realize how the way he acted came across as proud. Elizabeth denies Mr. Darcy on the grounds that he ruined the happiness of Jane and Mr. Wickham.